Welcome, and thank you for letting these old stories keep you company tonight. This is The Sleeping Shogun, a quiet place where the long night is filled with the slow, gentle tales of old Japan. Tonight we follow a single day, the 15th day of the ninth month in the year 1600, when two armies met in a small mountain basin called Sekigahara, and the future of Japan was settled before nightfall. It is remembered as the largest battle ever fought on Japanese soil, the day that decided the fate of the realm. But this is not a story of suspense, and you may as well know the ending now. The outcome was decided before the day began. The pledges had been signed, the arrangements sealed, the ink already dry, while the soldiers were still marching through the rain. What we will follow tonight is not the question of who would win. We will follow the men who did not know, the thousands who walked all night through the mud, who built fences in the dark, who ate cold rice in the fog, and waited for an answer that had already been written. There is nothing here that will startle you. The fighting, when it comes, is told from a distance, without cruelty and without glory, and it passes quickly, as it did in truth. Most of this night is rain and mist and waiting. You do not need to hold on to the names or the hours. They will pass through you, the way the fog passed over the valley. So settle in now. Adjust your pillow and let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. If you fall asleep long before the day is decided, that is exactly as it should be. It was decided long ago, with or without any of us. Now, as the rain begins to fall on the road from Ogaki, let us begin. Walking through the rain, walking through the rain. On the 14th night of the ninth month in the year 1600, a heavy autumn downpour turned the ground around Ogaki Castle into a vast, clinging expanse of mud. The rain fell steadily, cold and uncompromising, washing away the summer warmth and soaking through the layers of cotton and heavy lacquer worn by the thousands of men who were beginning to move through the dark. They left the castle in absolute silence. No torches were permitted, and no lanterns were swung from the crests of spears. The darkness was intended to be a shield, hiding the departure of the Western Army from the watchful eyes of the scouts who lay in wait along the surrounding hills. For the common foot soldier, the world had shrunk to the width of the shoulders of the man directly in front of him, to the sound of wet straw sandals splashing into deep puddles, and to the weight of a wet matchlock musket wrapped in oiled paper to keep the powder dry. The route before them was the Makita Road, a 16-kilometer stretch of narrow track that wound its way toward the small mountain basin known as Sekigahara. Under ordinary circumstances, 16 kilometers was a standard day's march for men accustomed to walking from dawn until dusk. But under the weight of an autumn storm, in a darkness so dense that a man could scarcely see his own hand stretched out before him, every step became an act of deliberate labor. The mud pulled at their feet, threatening to swallow sandals and unbalance anyone carrying the heavy wooden boxes of ammunition or the long bamboo shafts of spears. At the front of this long, invisible column marched the men under Gamo Satoye. Behind them came the seasoned veterans from the southern domain of Satsuma, led by Shimazu Yoshihiro, their armor rattling softly in the dark as they maintained a rhythmic, steady pace. Bringing up the absolute rear of the movement was the massive contingent of Ukita Hide, whose task it was to ensure that the tail of the army did not fray or lose its way in the blind blackness of the night. Somewhere within this slow, dark procession rode Ishida Mitsunari. He was not a warrior by training, but a bureaucrat, a man who had spent his life balancing ledgers, calculating rice yields, and organizing the vast logistics of a unified nation under his late master. On this night, he was suffering from a severe bout of stomach pain, brought on by the cold and the rain. Yet he remained on his horse, enduring the rhythmic jolts of the animal's stride through the mud. To the casual observer, had there been one in that empty dark, this midnight march might have seemed like the grand, desperate opening move of a campaign that would decide the fate of the realm. It had all the trappings of dramatic history, the hidden movement, the silent commanders, the thousands of men marching toward an unknown dawn through a blinding storm. Yet, the truth of that night was far colder and much quieter than the long, dramatic legends that would later be written to explain it. History has a habit of looking backward and seeing a grand gamble where there was, in reality, only the execution of an old arrangement. On that very same night, a formal pledge was already on its way to the fortress on Mount Matsuo, or had already arrived there, dispatched by the heavyweights of the opposing Eastern Army, Ii Naomasa and Honda Tadakatsu. It was addressed to the senior retainers of Kobayakawa Hideaki, the young commander who held the highest and most strategic ground on the western edge of the basin. The text of the document was straightforward, written with the dry precision of legal scribes. It promised the full security of the Kobayakawa family's ancestral lands, guaranteed new estates, and confirmed a permanent alliance with the house of Tokugawa once the coming confrontation was resolved. It was a piece of paper that effectively dissolved the grand tension of the campaign before a single arrow had been notched or a single grain of gunpowder had been lit. On this night, the conclusion of the great dispute was already fixed, recorded in black ink on paper that had dried long before the rain began to fall on the marchers below. The outcome had already been decided on the tables of administrators and through the quiet negotiations of trusted messengers. The thousands of men now stumbling through the dark, their breath rising in short white clouds against the midnight air, believed they were marching toward an open question, toward a day where their own strength and courage would tip the scales of the empire. They did not know that the scales had already been weighted, the numbers settled, and the signatures dried. The men who were walking were the only ones who did not know that the battle was over before it began. As the hours drifted toward the early morning, the column continued its slow crawl through the wilderness. The castle they had left behind was now nothing more than a dark shape against the weeping sky, and the hills of Sekigahara were drawing closer with every painful step. There were no grand speeches, no stirring banners unfurled against the dark, and no reassuring words passed down the line. There was only the endless, heavy sound of the rain striking the leaves of the forest, the dull squelch of thousands of sandals pressing into the deep clay, and the heavy, sightless dark that enveloped both the leaders on their horses and the common men who followed them on foot. Before dawn, hands binding the fences. Before dawn, hands binding the fences. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, the vanguard of the Western Army, composed of the tired rows of the Ishida contingent, finally reached the northern base of the low hill known as Sasaoyama. The march had ended, but there was no permission for the men to lie down in the grass, nor any time to seek shelter beneath the dripping branches of the pines. The long hours of walking through the midnight storm were followed immediately, without a single moment of transition, by the heavy, exhausting labor of fortification. The men, their muscles already stiff from the cold and their sandals encrusted with the thick clay of the valley, were ordered to construct a defensive line that would shield their position from the inevitable advance of the eastern forces. Through the absolute blackness of the early morning, under a sky that continued to weep a steady, miserable drizzle, the quiet but frantic work of engineering began. The valley of Sekigahara was a place defined by its damp soil and its vulnerability to the elements, and on this night, the earth itself became the primary adversary for the men tasked with shaping it. Without the aid of torches, which remained strictly forbidden to prevent the enemy from discovering their exact layout, the foot soldiers relied entirely on their sense of touch. They handled long, rough logs of wood, heavy and swollen with the rain, lifting them into place to form a double row of defensive palisades. These wooden stakes, the babosaku, were driven deep into the soft, yielding earth, their wet surfaces slick against the calloused palms of the laborers. Hands that had been gripping spear shafts for hours were now wrapped around coarse hemp ropes, binding the timbers together in the dark, the rough fibers cutting into wet skin as the knots were pulled tight to ensure the structure would withstand the shock of a cavalry charge. Alongside the wooden fences, the soldiers used simple iron shovels and their bare hands to pile up the wet earth, forming low, crude ramparts that ran along the slope of the hill. Every shovel of mud was heavy, saturated with water, and clinging to the blades of their tools with a stubborn weight that required a deliberate effort to dislodge. The smell of disturbed earth, mixed with the sharp scent of wet grass, old thatch, and the sour odor of damp cotton and hemp, rose from the long ditches as the men worked in a rhythmic, communal silence. There were no shouts of command, only the low, grunted breaths of men lifting timber, the dull thud of heavy wooden mallets striking the tops of stakes, and the wet, squelching sound of hundreds of sandals tramping the ground into a uniform mire. A nameless foot soldier, his shoulders trembling slightly under his wet cotton tunic, spent those hours moving from one stake to the next, checking the tight turn of the ropes by touch alone, his world entirely reduced to the texture of wet bark, the cold pull of clay against his shins, and the persistent murmur of the rain. While the western slopes of the valley were thus transformed into a network of wooden barriers and fresh earthworks, a corresponding movement was beginning just a few kilometers to the east. The departure of the Western Army from their old fortress had not gone unnoticed, and the intelligence had soon reached the high ground of Okayama in Akasaka, where the commander of the Eastern Army had maintained his position. Shortly after midnight, turned by the news that the valley ahead was being occupied, the command was given for the entire eastern host to advance. The long lines of men, beginning with the large division under Fukushima Masanori, began to move out from their camps, spilling down onto the roads that led into the narrow basin of Sekigahara. Among them was the leader of the Eastern Coalition, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who left his hillside station not on a horse, but carried within the small, enclosed frame of a wooden palanquin. The vehicle lurched slightly as the bearers picked their way through the dark, their steps cautious on the slick paths, the rain drumming a steady, monotonous rhythm against the roof of the carriage. Inside the small space, surrounded by the dark and the damp air of the Mino Mountains, the commander sat in silence, moving forward at the exact same pace as his thousands of foot soldiers who marched on foot beside him. There was no grandeur in this midnight pursuit, only the administrative necessity of placing an army in the path of another, a massive reallocation of human weight across a landscape that remained completely invisible to those who were traversing it. Back on the slopes of Sasao-yama, as the last hours before the dawn arrived, the frantic pace of the earthworks began to slow. The double row of horse barriers now stretched across the base of the hill, a dark, jagged shadow against the gray mist that was beginning to rise from the valley floor. The ditches had been dug, the soil piled into low ramparts, and the positions secured as best they could be in the space of a single night. The night-long labor had reached its functional conclusion, and the tools were finally laid down in the mud. The soldiers, their energy entirely spent, did not seek out dry places that did not exist. Instead, they simply sat down where they stood, leaning their backs against the wet wood of the palisades they had just bound together. They sat with their knees drawn up to their chests, their wet hands tucked into their sleeves for warmth, staring out into the sightless expanse of the valley, waiting for the sky to change. Dawn, cold rice in the mist. Dawn, cold rice in the mist. As the early morning light began to seep into the narrow basin of Sekigahara, it brought no clarity to the valley floor, but rather a thick, heavy blanket of white fog that rose directly from the wet soil and the mountain streams. The late-night rain had dissolved into a persistent, fine drizzle, and the moisture hung suspended in the chilled air, trapping the thousands of men in a world without horizons. The contemporary record noted that the mist was so dense that a man could not see more than 100 paces in front of his own position. When the heavy white bank shifted slightly under a sudden breath of cold wind, the silk banners and distant crests of another division would appear for a few brief moments, ghostly and indistinct against the gray hillside, before the fog settled down once more and swallowed them completely. For the thousands of common foot soldiers waiting behind the freshly bound palisades of Sasao-yama, the morning was an exercise in pure endurance. They were soaked through to the skin, their cotton tunics and heavy hemp undergarments holding the cold moisture against their bodies. The air carried a heavy, distinct smell born of a damp army, the sharp, metallic tang of wet iron armor, the earthy smell of trampled clay, the bitter scent of old straw sandals, and the heavy, sour odor of wet lacquer and raw leather that rose from their straps as the moisture softened them. Every movement was accompanied by the soft, wet rustle of heavy cloth and the dull clatter of damp wooden scabbards against their sides. There was no warmth to be found in the valley, and the men remained where they had sat since the completion of the earthworks, their knees pulled tight to their chests to preserve what little heat remained in their muscles. It was during these quiet, sightless hours before the onset of the conflict that the soldiers turned to their morning sustenance. They reached into the small, woven bags of their koshi-byoro, the ration pouches tied about their waists, and drew out their cold rice. For most, it was a hard, cold ball of pressed rice, nigiri meshi, or a handful of brittle, dried hoshi-e that had to be chewed slowly to let the saliva soften the grain. The meal was simple, structured entirely by the rigid regulations of military logistics. The standard daily allowance was 6 go of rice per man, accompanied by a modest portion of yakimiso, a dense paste of fermented soybeans, salt, and grain that had been baked over a fire to preserve it. To supplement this, they had dried strips of zuiki, the stalks of the taro plant that had been dried and salted, and perhaps a single, wrinkled umeboshi, whose sharp acidity caused their mouths to water against the dry salt of the paste. The distribution was measured with administrative strictness. A single portion of miso had to be shared among 10 men, and a small measure of salt was divided with the same economy. The foot soldier sat on his heels in the wet grass, his cold fingers breaking off a piece of the dark, salty miso to press against the cold rice. The flavor was strong, sharp, and familiar, a taste that belonged to winters in the provinces rather than the grandeur of an imperial campaign. There was no conversation among the rows of men, only the slow, rhythmic sound of chewing, the occasional dry cough of a throat irritated by the damp air, and the steady patter of the drizzle hitting their iron helmets. They ate with their eyes fixed on the blank wall of fog, completely unaware of how many men were doing the exact same thing just a few hundred yards away through the white gloom. A few kilometers to the south, near the base of Momobari-yama, a different breakfast was being served within the central pavilion of the Eastern Army. There, surrounded by his personal guards and secretaries, Tokugawa Ieyasu sat before a low wooden tray. His morning meal, the kind his house records describe for cold mornings, consisted of a piece of fish preserved in sake leaves, kasuzuke no uo, served alongside a bowl of hot, steaming rice. It was a sparse and deliberate diet for a man of his immense status, a reflection of a lifetime spent in the discipline of camps and the calculation of small margins. He ate with the methodical regularity of a clerk, his attention divided between the food and the reports brought in by scouts who had spent the night riding through the wet hills. No commentary was offered by the attendants, and no grand proclamations were made. It was simply the administrative routine of an old commander preparing for a long day of work. When the meals were finished, the silence returned to the valley of Sekigahara, heavier than before. The sun had risen somewhere behind the heavy clouds, turning the dark world into a uniform, luminous gray, but the fog remained stubbornly thick, clinging to the low hollows and the beds of the small streams. The thousands of men, their stomachs full of cold rice and salt, simply sat behind their weapons, listening. Out there in the white expanse, completely hidden from view, lay the weight of 2 waiting armies. Yet the only sound was the wind shaking the wet leaves of the forest, and the quiet, persistent dripping of the rain. The opening shot. When the mist faded. When the mist faded, the long silence of the morning finally broke. It did not happen at a single, precisely recorded minute, for the watches of that era were measured by the slow turning of the earth and the shifting of daylight. And on this morning, the sky offered no sun to mark the hours. Instead, the transition belonged entirely to the weather. As the heavy white banks of fog that had held the valley in a sightless embrace began to thin, dissolving into the higher air and pulling away from the muddy fields, the hidden geography of the basin revealed itself in fragments. Banners that had been nothing more than gray shadows against the hillside suddenly showed their colors: deep blues, whites, and dark crests, standing out against the wet grass. The thousands of men who had spent hours sitting in the damp cold, chewing their cold rice and listening to the steady patter of the drizzle, rose to their feet as the space between the two waiting armies shrunk from an immense, blind void into a visible stretch of trampled earth. It was in this uncertain light, while the last shreds of mist still clung to the low ditches and the beds of the streams, that the first weapon was discharged. Moving along the flank of the main vanguard, a small, determined detachment advanced through the wet grass, their movements quiet and focused as they pressed forward into the gray space between the lines. There were no dramatic theatrical games played with the sentries, and no long exchanges of challenges between individual champions in the manner of the older chronicles. There was only the deliberate, tactical positioning of men with loaded weapons. At a distance where the opposing ranks were just beginning to take shape through the remaining haze, this forward group raised their matchlock muskets, blew on the glowing tips of their hemp cords, and released the first volley into the twilight of the morning. The sound of that initial discharge was a sharp, dry crack that shattered the damp air, echoing instantly off the slopes of the surrounding hills. A moment later, the single volley was answered, and then the entire valley seemed to erupt in a continuous, deafening wall of noise that would not subside for hours. It was an environment defined entirely by sound, a massive acoustic weight that pressed down upon the soldiers. There was the rhythmic, deep thud of the jindaiko, the great army drums whose steady beat resonated through the wet ground and could be felt in the marrow of a man's bones long before it reached his ears. Above the drums rose the high, mournful wail of the horigai, the conch horn signals that drifted through the valleys, carrying orders from one hillside to another, like the cries of great, invisible birds. And beneath it all was the collective weight of the tokinokoi, the great shouting of tens of thousands of men, a vast, roaring human tide that drowned out the sound of the wind and the rain. With the noise came the smoke, the black powder of the era, heavy with sulfur and damp from the night's rain, did not clear easily from the narrow basin. It rose from the lines in thick, white clouds that smelled sharply of rotten eggs and burned wood, blending with the remaining morning fog until the air became thick and heavy to breathe. The soldiers moved through a twilight of their own making, their eyes stinging from the acrid fumes, their faces blackened by the residue of the powder as they reloaded their weapons with cold, wet fingers. Through this white gloom, the main divisions began their heavy closing movements. Along the northern slopes, beneath the palisades of Sasaoyama, the lines under the command of Ishida Mitsunari met the advancing rush of the eastern divisions, led by Kuroda Nagamasa and Hosokawa Tadaoki. Among the commanders at the very front of that early surge was Hosokawa Tadaoki, a man whose name belonged to the high circles of the capital's culture as much as to the field of war. He directed his men through the mud with the cold efficiency required of his rank, his attention fixed entirely on the wooden barriers ahead. In the ledger of that morning, his presence was a matter of administrative alignment. Yet history carries short, quiet threads that connect the battlefield to distant rooms. 2 months earlier, in Osaka, his wife, the lady remembered as Hosokawa Grazia, had died rather than be taken as a political hostage. On this morning, her husband simply stood in the sulphurous fog at the base of Sasao Yama, and the war moved forward by its own momentum, indifferent to the private endings that had preceded it. As the morning advanced, the conflict resolved into a brutal, heavy weight of numbers. The fighting was not a matter of elegant duels or heroic charges. It was the slow, exhausting work of the spear lines, defined by the sheer weight of iron and clay. The foot soldiers, their long wooden spears held at shoulder height, shoved against one another in the deep mire of the central plain, their sandals slipping on the wet clay until the ground became a uniform, brown paste. Every step required a conscious lift of the thigh. Every swing of a sword or thrust of a pike was slowed by the thick resistance of the mud and the heavy, water-soaked layers of their armor. There were no grand visual spectacles through the smoke, only the immediate, desperate reality of the man directly ahead, the cold impact of wooden shafts against iron chest plates, and the immense, collective strain of thousands of bodies pushing against thousands of others in the rain. The noise reached a constant, maximum pitch, a roaring machine of iron and wood that seemed to fill the entire universe, holding both armies in a frozen, agonizing balance where no ground was gained, no line was broken, and the valley remained locked in the smoke. The unmoving hills. Silence on the high ground. Silence on the high ground. As the morning progressed, the immense noise of the central plain did not climb the steep slopes of the surrounding hills. Instead, it seemed to flatten against them, leaving the high positions in a state of suspended, unearthly quiet. To the southeast, the massive bulk of Mount Nangu rose into the gray sky, its dense, dark forests of pine and cedar holding the mist in their branches. On these slopes sat the divisions of the Mori and the Chosokabe, thousands of men stationed along the mountain paths, their banners damp and heavy from the morning drizzle. From their vantage point, the battle below was an abstract spectacle, a shifting floor of white smoke torn by tiny, brief flashes of orange fire, and a collective roar that sounded more like the murmur of a distant ocean than the work of iron and wood. Yet, despite repeated and increasingly urgent messages carried up the mountain by breathless runners from the central plain, the great host on Mount Nangu did not move. The common foot soldiers stood by their spears, their breath rising in small plumes as they watched the smoke below, waiting for the command to descend that never came. Their immobility was not a matter of local hesitation, nor was it due to any lack of preparation. It was the direct result of an administrative block. Stationed at the very base of the mountain, directly across the only road that led down into the valley, was the division under Kikawa Hiroi. Acting on a secret arrangement concluded weeks earlier with the Eastern commanders to ensure the safety of his house, Hiroa had placed his men like a physical boulder in the path of his own allies. He simply refused to advance, effectively trapping the thousands of troops above him on the wooden trails, condemned to watch a confrontation they could not reach. A few kilometers away, on the southern rim of the basin, The long ridges of Mount Matsuo presented an identical picture of absolute stillness. On this high ground, the army of Kobayakawa Hideaki, a force that numbered over 10,000 men, sat behind their defenses, looking down into the smoky cauldron of the plain. The autumn wind blew hard across the summit, shaking the dry grass around the fortification and cooling the sweat on the skin of the waiting sentries. Below them, men were dying by the hundreds in the mire of the plain. Yet on the mountain, the only sound was the rustle of the leaves and the steady creak of the wooden watchtowers. The soldiers sat on their heels, their hands tucked into their sleeves, their eyes fixed on the distant, chaotic movement of the banners below, completely silent. Later accounts of this day would look at this long morning of stillness and write a complex narrative of human hesitation. The chronicles would speak of a young commander paralyzed by an agonizing choice, torn between his old loyalties and the promises of a new master, balanced on the edge of a blade while the empire waited for him to speak. They would even add the story of a distant general who grew so desperate that he ordered his own guns to fire upon the mountain, a dramatic signal to force a choice through terror. Yet the records preserved in the quiet archives of the families tell a far more regular story. The ink on the pledges sent to the mountain had dried the previous evening, and the understandings had been reached long before the first fog had risen from the streams. The great delay was not a matter of a mind suspended in torment, but the slow, heavy movement of a massive administrative mechanism that operated by its own timing, indifferent to the speed of the combat below. History has a habit of adding the color of drama to hours that were, in reality, defined by the simple, heavy weight of waiting. The men on the mountain did not move because the arrangement had already settled their place, and the young leader simply watched the valley, his face clear of expression, while the wind carried the smell of sulfur up from the plain. The battle was being fought below by thousands of men who believed the day was still an open question, while above them, the silent hills held the finished answer in the cold air. Midday, the moving mountain. The moving mountain. At midday, the stillness of the high ground did not slowly dissolve. It ended with the abruptness of a collapsed dam. The contemporary letter written by the administrators Ishikawa Yasumichi and Hikosaka Motomasa noted with precision that as soon as the main battle became general, while the last of the morning fog still clung to the streams, the massive force under Kobayakawa Hideaki moved out from their positions. There was no moment of agonizing delay on the summit, and no threat of intimidation from distant guns was needed to stir the young leader from his position. The vast host simply rose from the dry grass, their banners catching the full light of the midday sky, and poured down the northern slope like a heavy slide of stone. The impact of their descent was immediate and devastating for the positions below. The sudden weight of over 10,000 fresh men, their armor clean and their energy unspent by the morning's labor, fell directly upon the exposed flank of the Western divisions stationed on the plain. The first to bear the full force of this relocation was the division under Otani Yoshitsugu, which held the low ridges of Fujikawa-dai. His men, already exhausted by hours of grinding, back and forth fighting against the eastern front lines, turned to find a new army cascading down the hillside behind them. The spear lines met in a brief, heavy collision of iron plates and wooden shafts, the sound of the impact echoing across the valley like a sudden clap of thunder. The resistance did not collapse at the first impact. The lines of Otani Yoshitsugu had been built to face the hillside, and they held against the first descent. Then, along the same flank, 4 more divisions, men who had stood all morning under Western banners, turned in sequence and joined the attack. Against that arithmetic, no line could stand. In the records of that noon, the end of the commander was recorded with the sparse brevity of a military log. Otani Yoshitsugu, his lines broken from the rear and his positions completely enveloped, ended his own life in the mud of his camp. With the fall of the Fujikawadai position, the structural integrity of the Western Army began to unravel with the rapid, mechanical precision of a line of falling tiles. The collapse was a matter of physical geography rather than a failure of spirit. As the southern flank dissolved, the remaining divisions were left isolated in the middle of a shifting field, their sides open to the cavalry of the Eastern Coalition that now poured through the gaps. On the Central Plain, the large contingent under Ukita Hide was the next to break, its ranks fracturing into small, scattered groups of men who sought the safety of the western hills as the eastern spears pressed into their center. Behind them, the division of Konishi Yukinaga was swept from its trenches, the defensive earthworks they had held since dawn, overridden by the sheer momentum of the pursuit. The line of failure moved steadily northward, finally reaching the double palisades at the base of Sasaoyama. The fortifications that had been bound together with hemp ropes during the midnight storm were now subjected to the full, combined weight of the victorious eastern divisions. The wooden stakes were chopped away with axes or pulled from the soft earth by teams of horsemen, and the low mud ramparts were trampled into a flat, characterless mire under thousands of passing sandals. The Ishida division, numbering fewer than 6,000 men after the morning's casualties, was systematically driven from the hillside. There was no grand, dramatic last stand through the smoke, and no long speeches were delivered from the crest of the hill. The position simply ceased to be a line of defense. Ishida Mitsunari left his station before the fences were completely cleared, turning his horse toward the narrow, rocky paths that led into the high forests of Mount Ibuki. His departure as quiet and unremarked as the general retreat of his men. By the time the sun had passed its highest point and begun its slow descent toward the western ridges, the great clamor that had filled the valley since the morning fog cleared had dropped to a fraction of its former volume. The massive concentration of human force that had occupied the basin since the previous night had been scattered into the surrounding wilderness in the space of a few short hours. The grand calculations of the campaign, the mobilization of provinces, and the movement of thousands of tons of supplies had reached their operational conclusion before the daylight had even begun to fade. Shortly after midday, the general result of the confrontation was already clear to the observers on the hills. The entire enterprise had been settled in a single morning, its end arriving with the dry, sudden finality of a shutter closing against the light. Afternoon. Those who sought to return home. Those who sought to return home filled the south road as the afternoon darkened. By the early afternoon, The central plain of Sekigahara had ceased to be a position of defense for the Western Army, and the space between the hills had filled with the long, disorganized movement of men retreating into the forests. Yet, near the center of the field, completely isolated by the sudden collapse of their allies, remained the small division from the southern domain of Satsuma, led by Shimazu Yoshihiro. Their numbers were few. Historical records differ, with some counting only 300 men and others estimating up to 1,000. But they stood in a tight, motionless circle beneath their white banners, surrounded on all sides by the advancing lines of the Eastern Coalition. The movement they chose in that hour was not a retreat in the ordinary sense, nor was it a desperate final charge meant to win the day. The core of their action was a single, practical necessity. They had to find a path out of the valley and back to their own province. They did not fight to preserve the coalition, nor to change the outcome that had already been recorded on paper the night before. They fought simply to return to the south. Rather than turning toward the western mountains where the other divisions were scattering, the Shimazu contingent raised their spears, blew upon the matches of their muskets, and advanced directly forward, straight into the path of the oncoming eastern vanguard, and past the very position where Tokugawa Ieyasu held his center. The breakthrough was achieved by a steady, costly sacrifice of numbers. As the small group pressed through the heavy ranks of the enemy, men detached themselves from the main body in small groups, turning to face the pursuers at every narrow ditch and muddy turn of the path. They did not use grand names for this labor, nor did the records of that afternoon treat it as a matter of heroic legend. It was the simple, mechanical work of holding a line until the men behind had passed. These small rear guards stayed behind in the mire, their spears leveled against the cavalry, fighting until the space was cleared and their own numbers were spent. In this heavy, close-quarter fighting among the white smoke, Shimazu Toyohisa was left behind in the deep clay of a narrow valley. His name added to the records of the day's losses before the main body had even cleared the plain. The cost was heavy for the pursuers as well. As the eastern divisions pressed in to close the gap left by the breakthrough, several of their highest commanders rode directly into the line of fire. Naomasa, who had spent the morning directing the forward movements of the eastern lines, was struck by a bullet from a matchlock musket, his armor broken by the impact as his horse stumbled in the mud. Shortly thereafter, the young commander Matsudaira Tadayoshi was also wounded, his advance halted by the fire of the rearguard. Yet the small column from Satsuma did not stop to count the casualties or to observe the damage they had left behind. They kept their eyes fixed on the southern road, their sandals tramping through the wet grass as their numbers grew smaller with every mile. By the time the afternoon had turned toward evening, the sound of the conflict had broken into small, isolated pockets of noise along the road to the south. Shimazu Yoshihiro and the remnants of his division had cleared the immediate basin of Sekigahara, moving past the small settlement of Makita as the light began to fail. They carried no trophies from the field, and their banners were torn and blackened by the residue of the day's powder. They had not changed the fate of the realm, nor had they preserved the cause for which they had been summoned from their distant homes. They were simply a small, quiet group of men walking through the autumn dusk toward the coast, their long shadows stretching out before them on the road toward Isa, while behind them, the empty battlefield fell into darkness. Night. The sound of the river. The sound of the river was the last thing to remain in the valley. By the middle of the afternoon, all organized resistance had dissolved, and the great confrontation that had occupied the basin since the previous night reached its quiet, administrative conclusion. The ceremonial verification of the day's losses, the kubi jikin, was carried out with the sparse efficiency required by custom. The names entered into the logs, and the identities checked by the lights of the low lamps. There were no speeches or long pronouncements to mark the close of the campaign. The business of the field moved from the physical labor of the infantry to the quiet work of the brush and the inkstone. As the daylight faded behind the heavy mass of Mount Ibuki, a rapid, unnatural chill settled over the muddy fields, and the thick gray clouds that had held the sky since dawn began to lower once more, dissolving back into a cold, steady rain. Within this darkening landscape, the massive apparatus of the state began its evening routine. Tokugawa Ieyasu left the forward position on the plain and retired to the town of Ogaki, where he took up his quarters for the night. His chosen lodging was not the main keep of the fortress, but a long, wooden outbuilding by the southern gate. In the days preceding the battle, the defensive engineers had systematically stripped the roofs of the primary castle structures to prevent them from shattering under the impact of artillery fire, leaving the grand rooms open to the autumn sky. Only the narrow gatehouse had been left intact, its roof still undisturbed, and it was beneath this small, dry ceiling that the commander lay down to rest, the water dripping from the eaves onto the stones outside. Before he slept, while the rain was still fresh on the roads, he sat by a single candle and dictated a formal letter of victory to Date Masamune in the far north. The text was brief, recording the dispersal of the western divisions and the immediate plans for the occupation of the remaining castles. The end of the great campaign was, in its final hours, an exercise in record-keeping, a matter of dispatching riders and sealing paper before the ink could damp. Out in the wider province, beyond the dry rooms of the commanders, the remnants of the day were being swallowed by the night. Through the dark forests of Mount Ibuki, Ishida Mitsunari continued his slow, painful retreat on foot, his sandals slipping on the wet clay of the mountain trails as he carried his persistent stomach pain into the wilderness. He was not alone in that dark. The deep ravines and thick thickets of the mountain were filled with thousands of nameless men who had worn the Western colors that morning. They lay beneath the dripping ferns, their light iron plates cold against their skin, their wet hands tucked into their sleeves as they listened to the sounds of the night. There were no pursuits into the high ridges, and no grand searches carried out through the blind blackness of the trees. The victors remained in their camps along the plain, while the defeated simply hid in the valleys, their world reduced to the damp smell of pine needles, the empty weight of their stomachs, and the slow, heavy drop of their own breath against the cold air. In the center of the valley, where the great horse barriers had been broken and the trenches filled with the refuse of the fighting, the silence became total. The thousands of voices that had filled the morning, the deep resonance of the jindaiko, and the high wail of the conch horns had vanished completely. leaving no echo behind them in the narrow basin. The small lanterns that had flickered in the evening camps were put out one by one, and the distant torches of the night patrols grew fewer, their orange sparks blinking out through the fine, drifting mist. There was no grand lesson left upon the ground, and no voice rose from the dark to explain the meaning of the hours that had just passed. The valley had returned to its original state, a small and ordinary corridor between the mountains, indifferent to the shifting of the houses or the names of those who ruled them. The only movement left was the steady rush of the Fujiko River, its cold waters swelling from the mountain rain, washing over the smooth gray stones of the shallows as it wound its way through the dark toward the sea. If these quiet hours have carried you gently toward sleep, then the night has done its work. Should you wish for more of these slow journeys, you are always welcome to follow the channel, so that the next long night finds its way to you. If you would rather stay in this world a little longer, there is the long, quiet life of Hosokawa Gracia waiting on this screen, the woman who died in Osaka 2 months before this battle, told from her first autumn to her last, by the light of a single lamp. And there is an ordinary day in the old city of Edo, in the long peace that this battle began, a day in which nothing happens at all. Both are long, both are slow, neither will wake you, but there is nothing left for you to do now. Adjust your quilt once more, let your breathing settle into the slow rhythm of the dark, and rest, easily and completely, until the day is fully wide.